Hey everyone, it's me, Dr. Garcia, and this is chapter 1 video for Psych 3090, Defining Violence. So let's get right into it. The first couple of slides you're going to see is our activity that we'll be working on back in class together, really thinking about some classroom guidelines about how we communicate each other and make sure that we have a space that is communal and people are sensitive and respectful. So we'll be working that in class. All right, so let's get right into our broad definition of violence. How do we even describe violence in general? Well, first of all, it's very difficult to define violence because there's so many different nuances and contexts that we have to take into consideration. But very broadly, we know that violence is any form of physical assault. And again, different groups will define it a different way. In criminal justice, it'll say it's a violent act that's perpetrated that also has, as a criminal offense. The World Health Organization defines it as a physical assault, but also includes psychological aggression. So, really, defining violence can be complicated. So, our broad definition is just to understand we know what violence is, but it's very discrete acts that are separate and distinct from one of each other. But at the same time, the individual and situation dynamics of violent behavior can vary. So, even though these discrete and distinctive acts are varied and are very different, they still share the same essential characteristics that bind them together in what we call the unity of human aggression. Now, that's a theme I'm going to talk about a few times more and provide you more content of information about that. That's what's something that's really important to take away from this, the beginning of these slides, which is, acts of violence are very distinctively different from one another. Yet at the same time, there are some fundamental characteristics that are always going to be the same. So acts of violence, and kind of review what I just said, are fundamentally different but similar. And one way that they're similar is because of perpetrator justification. So we have perpetrator beliefs, right? So regardless of the act of violence, is a kid bullying another kid, or a corporation that's being destructive in their activities, or a dictator who's engaging in genocide, people committing violent acts usually rely on the similar arguments to justify their violence. So perpetrators have specific beliefs. They feel that they were justified because they were provoked. So it's not an unfounded aggression, right? It was an acceptable form of violence because of the behavior of the victim. So we call that righteous slaughter. So that's the term that we use to describe perpetrators' beliefs when they feel that the act of violence was completely warranted and justified. People who commit violent acts often undergo this process. The first one, there was some kind of a transgression against them by another person who eventually becomes the victim. They perceive that transgression as a form of humiliation, which then is transformed into rage. And that rage then culminates into an act of violence. So that's the process. And it's important to understand that process. A transgression, a perceived humiliation, which transforms into rage, what turns into violence. Now, overlapping context, that's important to know too. Violence does not occur in a vacuum. It's not in just isolated spaces. Violence occurs in overlapping contexts. So perpetrators that are violent in one setting are typically violent in other settings as well. Throughout this, you'll see some little mini quizzes or think about it. So this is where you're going to pause, open up your PowerPoint or your slides, and go ahead and take your video. Take your little mini quizzes as you see throughout. All right, let's talk a little bit more about connecting violence and specifically the spillover theory. So we're going to be connecting theories and concepts to what it looks like for violence to be sort of executed and perpetrated. So the spillover theory, it results in illegitimate forms of violence. So let's give some examples of what that is. So first of all, we have a lot of values in American society that allows us to justify acts of violence, right? And so that spills over into other settings. We also have something like the brutalization hypothesis. The brutalization hypothesis is, means that we live in a society and a culture that desensitizes death and devalues life. And some of that comes from that idea, like, there's justified times when you can engage in violence because somebody deserved it. And also an example of that is the death penalty. The death penalty desensitizes human life and devalues it. war also as well. This is not unique to the United States, but war increases the rates of illegitimate violence. And some of that could be soldiers returning from the battlefield, high rates of intimate partner violence. But we also know in larger society as well, there's an uptick in violence when a country is at war. Now, I want you to go to this next slide and I want you to think about it. So consider the brutalization hypotheses. Think about a couple of questions or prompts that I'm talking to you about. Maybe write some notes about it and we'll come back to class and discuss. Now, continuing on with the spillover effect to understand sort of how the spillover effect have all these different contexts that help us to understand violence and acts of violence. Qualities of violence transcend time and place. It doesn't really matter where you are, what geographic location you're in, what time of the decade it is, we still see human violence as an issue, regardless of whether you live in the 1930s or now in the 2020s. Young men are typically responsible for the most acts of violence that we see in our country, regardless of the time period. That has been consistent over the last 200 years. Violence is linked to a set of shared qualities. I mentioned I'm going to kind of say that theme again. Even though all forms of violence are not identical and they are distinctively and discretely different from each other, because you have to take into consideration things like who is the perpetrator, who is the victim, what is the victim's maybe gender identity, their biological sex, what was the relationship between the victim and the offender, what was the motivation of that particular act of violence, what was the method that they, or the weapon of choice that was used, right? So all these different nuances involved in an assault. So all forms of violence are not identical because we have to sort of unpack and take a look at those things, but nonetheless, there are some sets of shared qualities, which is aggression and harm. And typically doesn't have to be, but physical violence could also include things like, that the perpetrator's beliefs, like feeling rationalized and justified in what they were doing. Okay. So now let's go into a little bit more depth of actually defining violence. And you'll see this goes along with this particular chapter in the textbook. You can read the chapter for more depth of understanding, but I am pulling out content that I think will help us to understand. So first of all, we have to understand that how we define violence is a little bit different. The way that criminal justice might define violence is different than how the World Health Organization might define violence versus how a researcher might start to define violence versus how society in general defines violence and how different cultural expectations and norms define violence, right? So it's an underlying phenomenon that can be difficult to recognize. It's not always easy to recognize violence because some forms of violence are not actually what we always think about, which is like physical assault, robbery, murder. The World Health Organization includes not just physical violence or like some kind of a physical attack on the body, but also psychological aggression is involved with deprivation and neglect against another human. Now, here's another area where we have to think about our definition of violence. We know that it's human perpetrated, but also some definitions of violence include natural forces like fires and earthquakes, or even accidents, that some automobile accidents or car accidents are so tragic that they're very violent as well. We also have to take into consideration the emotional reactions and perceptions of acceptability, right? When we say that means a lot of people, like if you believe that certain acts of violence are okay, and so then therefore it is actually not violence. Like that act was an act, but it's okay because that person deserved it. Therefore, it's really not violence. So we have perceptions of acceptability when we pick and choose when to accept violence. And so that's another thing that kind of makes the definition of violence very nuanced. And then again, there's that issue again with violent people. They feel very legitimate and moral to protect their valuables, themselves, or even their honor and their pride. And therefore, they feel that it's appropriate and it was morally, acceptable to harm or hurt another person. Now, the context of violence, and let me take a moment to say there's a difference between definition and context. A definition is a statement that explains like the meaning or the semantics. And as you can see, there's some interesting nuances about how we define that. So what's helpful about context is like the circumstances, the settings, the situations, things like, culture that help us to understand the semantics or the meaning, or in other words, the definition of violence with a little bit more depth. So one thing is that we have to understand when we think about violence, there's a context in terms of sympathy for similar victims. So if you feel like a victim is very similar to you, then you have more sympathy. But that sympathy is lessened when you don't recognize the victim, when the victim is someone different than who you would know or what you look like yourself, right? So there's those issues as well. We know that rationalizing, again, accepting violence is something that we have to understand. That's part of that definition of violence. I've said that many times. The type of violence affects your perception and the acceptance of violence as well. So therefore, we know that people judge acts of violence very selectively. That's violent. That one's not. That was deserved. That is something they should have done. And I would have done the same thing, right? So we selectively judge violence in terms of when it is or when it isn't. Again, defining violence, we might have the definition from a criminal justice perspective, the World Health Organization, from research perspective. But when we look at the context of violence and societies that are actually have humans that are perpetrating violence against each other, that's where the definition becomes really nuanced and muddied. Brutality, number of victims, and location can play a role as to whether or not it's considered an act of violence. So more gratuitous cruelty and torture is completely unacceptable, and that is violence. But if that sort of torture is done in the home, historically in the United States, any violence at home has been more acceptable than if it's done with a stranger or in public. And that's shown by our child abuse laws. We didn't have child abuse laws as federal government until the early to mid 1970s. And even then, it took a long time for the states to adopt these laws. Some states adopted them earlier than others. Some states took as long as well into the 1980s to be able to even have uh, uh, child abuse laws, because there's a belief in American society, well, that whatever happens in the home, that's your home and that's your business, and I'm not interfering with that. And yeah, children should be spanked, right? And so that's not perceived. Spanking is not perceived an act of violence either. So violence and aggression are often used interchangeably, but they really are two different things. And so researchers do draw those distinctions. Bartle and Bartle are two researchers that work together, and they talk about aggressive physical behavior, that is violence, but aggression is behavior that is psychologically harmful, that's used in connection with a person's like their own psychological affect, demeanor, and mindset, right? So aggression and violence are not interchangeable. They're two different things, where one is an aggressive physical behavior and the other is more a psychological harm. Violence versus aggression. All right, so let's keep going with the context of violence. There's 6 different ways that we can look at the context of violence: instrumental violence, or acts of violence, which there's a means to an end, right? So the violent act was just to help the perpetrator get to the end result, like an armed robbery. The armed robbery, the goal really is money, but the assault is a means to the end to get the money. So that's instrumental violence. We have expressive violence that's motivated by emotion, like anger or jealousy. So that violent act really helps that person to fulfill some type of internal or intrinsic desire that's been motivated by emotion. We have interpersonal violence. It's often things like, assaults, rapes, robberies, and murder. And it's often the thing that we think about in our minds when we talk about violence or think about violence. But we know that violence is much more than that. We have institutional violence, the violent behaviors that are perpetrated in organizational settings. We have structural violence, where we see these like systematic discriminatory social arrangements where, discrimination is practiced and perceived as an act of violence. And then we have denial of resources. We're a minority group, and I don't mean ethnic minority, anyone in this country with minority status, they're denied any access to needs for survival in their human development, things like access to education and healthcare and housing and nutrition. And we know that there's inequity, and that is also perceived as a context of violence as well. Here's another mini quiz for you to do based on the last few slides. Go at it, have fun, see what you know, what you know. Now, the other thing that we do that's important is measuring violence. So there's a couple of different ways that we tend to measure violence: reports to law enforcement or victimization surveys. We have uniform crime reporting, which is done by the FBI. It is the most widely used source of statistical information about violent crime. We have supplemental homicide reports, which helps us to get more information about the victim, the offender, the perpetrator, their gender, their race, the relationship they have. Then we have the NIBRS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. That digs in a lot more deeper and more specific than the UCR. So it, really starts to categorize crimes across 24 distinct categories with 46 offenses and 53 data points from victims, their property, and the offenders. But we have overall state reporting failures, right? So the state of California only has provided about 7% of population is covered in the reports, 19% in New York, 17% in Massachusetts, and 0% in Florida, right? So we're not doing a really good job of capturing this information. The Bureau of Justice does have a set of statistics. So these are victimization surveys that helps us to we talk directly to the victims and they can do self-report surveys. The Bureau of Justice survey has more depth. It captures things that some of the other victimization surveys don't capture, things like intimate partner violence, rape, and even sexual assault victimizations. Okay. When we measure violence, we look at prevalence rates, which is the proportion in a given population who's ever experienced victimization. An example of a proportion, it's just a ratio. So like 1 of every 3 women have experienced IPV in California, right? So it's really considered like a number in comparison to relation to the whole. We have 12-month proportion rates as well. And then we have National IPV Survey. The National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey is assumed to be representative of the US population. And then we also measure offending behavior. And we use this National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And researchers chart changes over time. It is longitudinal, been collecting data on about 5,000 people who were born in between 1980 to 1984. And they have since been surveyed 19 times to capture how violence has changed over time. Surveys are obviously problematic. How demographic characters are even defined. There's language character considerations. Sexual and gender identity can be complicated because a lot of times the surveys are not distinctively seeing the differences or the nuances in that. For instance, sexual orientation, just an example, encompasses 3 components: sexual attraction, sexual behavior, and sexual identity. So those are 3 different things. You could be sexually attracted to a certain partnership, but you might define yourself with a different sexual identity, and then your behavior presents itself in a completely different way. So we're not capturing the actual, nuances that come with the dynamics of sexual and gender identity as well. Even though gender identity is your internal sense of your own gender that is different from your sex assigned at birth, we know that not all the surveys are really capturing that appropriately. Same with race and ethnicity, for example. There's not a lot of surveys that will kind of allow you to go into multiple races or mixed races. And then there's too few uh, data that's collected on certain groups. And so then we have generalization problems as well. Violence in the United States, let's take a little bit of time to do that. We're almost done here. As of 2021, more than 4.5 million people have become victims of violence. There are different factors that affect risks of violence, things of like whether or not there's police protection in your community, maybe your own help-seeking behaviors, whether you're going to call, like we don't even know all of this data, right? Risks of violence. If you're a female, you're at higher rates of violence. Age can be a determination, things of that nature. We do have vicarious victimization as well, where we actually get excited in American society to see violence. We like to see violence in sports games. We love watching violence in our TV shows and our video games, right? We have very graphic acts and very explicit and realistic violence that are coming through with us. And in spite of that, even though Americans overall tend to be excited about seeing things that are violent, we constantly worry about violence. And in fact, whenever there's a perceived threat of violence, we change our own behavior. But what we do know is that at least gun violence victimizations are trending downward in the United States. And all acts of violence have been trending downward for the last 2 decades as well. So, but in spite of that, we have a lot of fear and worry. So here's another think about it, thinking about the fear of and worry of victimization, which I will get into more detail once we get back into class. And now let's talk about the culture of violence. Americans have created and embraced a culture of violence, right? We know that we have specific values and beliefs that come with traditions, rituals, and rules for behavior. We have different cultural norms that allow for sort of punitive behavior between different genders or biological sex. We know that we've accepted a lot of intimate partner violence against females in our court of laws and in our homes, it's more acceptable. Our whole American history has condoned and tolerated violent responses. We expect violent responses from the Revolutionary War to when we committed genocide against Native Americans, or excuse me, indigenous populations in the name of civilization, right? So American history has condoned and expects violence responses. And even, Alexander Hamilton, I'm sure you know that story, was killed in a duel between him and Aaron Burr because of the dishonor that Aaron Burr felt. And so we do have a culture of honor in our society where if you feel disrespected or dishonored, it's okay for you to sort of engage in some type of a violent act because there's been a transgression against your pride and your honor. This typically happens more often in the South when it comes regionally in the United States, but it also happens within different subcultures as well. So certain subcultures that are very daring and expectation is courage, you have more of a defense status within the larger culture. These are subcultures. Things like gang affiliations, right? If someone disrespected your honor or pride or even your affiliation with your gang, then you're expected to go out and definitely engage in some type of homicide, which could be response, could be some physical assault, an altercation, some type of a domestic quarrel that results in homicide is relatively common when we start looking at different subcultures' expectations about how you perceive and accept and expect to respond with violence. Okay, that's it for this chapter, everyone. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you back in class.